There is a book that the Egyptians themselves knew should never be in just anyone's hands, not because it was banned by a pharaoh, not because it contained spells capable of destroying enemies. The reason is more unsettling than any prohibition of power. This book reveals that your mind, right now as you watch this, is actively constructing the experience you call reality. And that if you don't know how that process works, you will keep building it the wrong way, indefinitely. The Book of Thoth I'm going to show you here is not what most people imagine. It's not the Thoth Tarot of Aleister Crowley. It's not the so-called emerald tablets that circulate in New Age forums. It is a real text, written in Egyptian demotic, preserved in papyri from the Ptolemaic period, and rigorously translated for the first time by papyrologists Richard Jasno and Carl Theodor Zazuzi in a work that took decades. This text exists, it was written, and what it says when you read it carefully enough is something that shifts the ground beneath your feet, because it does not treat the mind as an observer of reality, it treats the mind as its architect. An architect working at all times, with discipline or without it, with intention or without it, with awareness of what it is building, or completely in the dark. The danger of the Book of Thoth is not in its rituals, it is not in its sacred names. The danger is that once you understand the mechanism it describes, there is no longer any comfortable position as a spiritual spectator. You are the laboratory, and the experiment has already begun. To enter the Book of Thoth, you first have to enter the world in which it was written. Imagine Egypt during the Ptolemaic period, not the Egypt of the pyramids and the great pharaohs, but an Egypt already marked by centuries of Greek influence. Alexander had founded Alexandria, the language of the cults was shifting. The exchange of ideas was vibrant, cosmopolitan, Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and Persians all living in the same city, and the temples still guarded something no conquest had managed to erase, a science of the invisible, passed from priest to priest, body to body, across generations. It was in this environment that the papyri of the Book of Thoth were written, kept inside temples, not to circulate, not to be copied freely, but to remain where only the initiated had access. The structure of the text is immediately strange for anyone expecting a grimoire or a list of incantations. What we find is a dialogue, a long one, repetitive on first reading, but deeply structured once you start to see the pattern. On one side, Thoth, the scribe of the gods, the one who weighs the souls of the dead, the one who knows the true names of all things, and who, according to Egyptian tradition, invented language itself as a technology for ordering the cosmos. On the other side, a disciple with no famous name. His only declared qualification, and this is deliberate, is that he loves knowledge, not power, not fame, knowledge itself. And what the text records is not the immediate transmission of secrets. What it records is a process. Thoth corrects. Thoth rejects answers. Thoth dismantles the disciple's certainties and waits for him to return, not defeated, but more honest. The goal of all of this is a place, the house of life. That name will come up again. For now, know only what it was in the physical world, a sacred complex inside the great Egyptian temples, where the most secret texts were preserved, copied, and transmitted. A living heart of initiatory knowledge, not a public library, but a chamber that only opened for those who had gone through what it demanded. In the Book of Thoth, the house of life ceases to be merely a structure of stone. It becomes an internal possibility, a chamber that can exist inside the disciple who has been sufficiently transformed to hold it. To enter that chamber, study alone is not enough. You have to become someone else. And the process of becoming someone else is exactly where things get difficult enough that most people never get there. This book is not a manual of spells. It is the map of the consciousness behind all the magic you have ever tried to make work, and that sometimes worked more or less than expected, without you knowing why. But here is the point that almost no one mentions when they talk about the Book of Thoth. There is a story within the Egyptian tradition itself, not a late text, not a modern reinterpretation, that the priests used as an explicit warning about what happens when someone accesses this kind of knowledge before they are ready. The protagonist of this story is a prince named Setne Khamwas. Setne was not just anyone, he was the son of Pharaoh Ramesses II. He was educated, scholarly, respected on both banks of the river, and he wanted the Book of Thoth with an urgency that could not bear the weight of the process, the urgency of someone who wants results without any willingness to be transformed. So he entered a tomb. He took the book from the hands of a mummy, literally from a dead man who still held the text, and walked out carrying what he believed to be power. What happened next is not divine punishment in the conventional sense. It is not an offended God hurling curses. What happens is more precise and more relevant. Setne's mind, upon touching the mechanism without being prepared to sustain it, begins to generate scenarios that feel completely real. He loses his children. He watches his own wife lie with another man in front of the entire people. He is publicly humiliated in ways that make the dignity of his entire previous life look like a joke, until an elder tells him, "Return the book." And when he does, he discovers that none of it had actually happened. Every loss was an illusion. Every humiliation was a construction of his own mind, amplified by the mechanism he had touched without preparation. This story is not folklore. It is a technical instruction about what the Book of Thoth considers the real risk. Not spells misused, not rituals performed incorrectly. The real risk is that a mind without inner alchemy, upon touching the reality-building mechanism, amplifies with equal precision both what you want to create and what you fear the most. And what most of us carry with the greatest emotional charge is not what we want, it is what we fear. What the Book of Thoth is describing is something more structural and more uncomfortable than any narrative of divine punishment. The human mind creates with equal force, whether it is disciplined or not. It does not stop while you meditate, does not slow down while you sleep, does not pause because you do not yet feel ready to manifest. It works all the time. And what fuels the creation is not your declared intentions in spiritual practices. It is the emotional content you sustain most consistently, your unexamined fears, your inherited patterns, the stories you repeat to yourself about who you are and why things are the way they are. This shows up in concrete ways. The person who sabotages relationships at the exact moment they start to deepen, not by conscious choice, but because the inner temple was built around the belief that intimacy is danger. The temple operates, creates the distance that confirms the belief, and the person experiences as destiny what is actually architecture. There is also the spiritual seeker who collects practices with the same logic Setne used to want the book, the urgency to get somewhere without any willingness to be transformed along the way. Each new technique seems like the right answer. Each ritual that does not work becomes proof that the problem lies elsewhere, in the wrong practice, the wrong teacher, the wrong phase of the moon. The inner temple remains untouched because it was never examined. The danger of the Book of Thoth is not on the page. It is in the mirror the page holds up. For a moment, I need you to consider something that habitual skepticism will want to dismiss before hearing it out. When someone starts talking about creating reality with the mind, the resistance is almost automatic, and often it is a legitimate resistance, because most of the time what is being sold is technique without transformation, affirmation without alchemy, visualization without the inner work that would make the visualization coherent with who the person actually is. The Book of Thoth knew about this problem more than 2,000 years ago. The premise that most modern spiritualities fail to sustain is this: the mind does not create only during morning meditation or when you are focused on a ritual. It creates all the time, and disordered creation, the kind that comes from unexamined patterns, is always more powerful than the conscious intention of someone who has not yet gone through the process of inner purification. Setne did not lose because of any external curse. Setne lost because his mind, upon touching the mechanism without the preparation that mechanism demands, amplified what he carried inside, and what he carried inside was the same thing most of us carry: desire for results without any willingness for the dissolution that real results require. That changes what I am about to show you, because now the question is no longer, how do I use the Book of Thoth to create what I want? The question becomes something else entirely. What is being created right now by what you already carry inside without you even noticing? To understand where this mechanism comes from, you have to go back to the origin of the lineage the Book of Thoth represents. There is a tradition with intellectual honesty. There is a tradition present in esoteric texts and certain currents of Hermeticism that associates Thoth with a figure older than historical Egypt itself. Thoth the Atlantean, the bearer of a spiritual science that would have survived the collapse of a prior civilization, preserved in temples, pyramids, and initiatory texts that kept transmitting that science long after the explicit memory of its origin had been lost. I am not stating this as a verifiable archaeological fact. I am stating it as an active esoteric myth. And esoteric myths that persist for millennia persist because they describe something true about the structure of inner experience, even when the literal narrative belongs to the symbolic register. What this lineage holds is this: there is a science of consciousness as ancient as anything we call civilization, a science that knew long before any modern psychology that the human mind has structure, and that this structure can be disciplined, purified, and operated with intention. Sacred Egyptian geometry enters here not as architectural decoration, but as technology. The golden ratio, the alignments of temples, the floor plan of the Great Pyramid, the proportions of the Eye of Horus, none of that was mere aesthetics. It was consciousness engineering. When I say that, I am not speaking of mystical speculation. I am describing what the Egyptian priests themselves explicitly claimed about their temples. Space, organized according to certain proportions, created specific states in those who inhabited it. An Egyptian temple was a machine for the transformation of consciousness, and the Book of Thoth, in symbolic language, says that the mind does exactly the same thing from within. Every belief you hold is a wall. Every story you repeat about yourself is a pillar. Every unexamined emotional pattern is an architectural element, a part of the structure that filters, organizes, and ultimately determines what you perceive as possible, as real, as inevitable. The text calls this, in indirect language, inner geometry. And just as a badly proportioned temple does not create the state of consciousness it was meant to create, even if built with the right materials, a badly structured mind does not generate the experience the person wants, even when that person is genuinely trying. In the nigredo, the darkening, the disciple is repeatedly corrected by Thoth. His answers are rejected, his certainties are undone one by one. What he thought he knew about himself begins to dissolve. Setne, in the story, lives through a complete and involuntary nigredo. Everything that defined him as powerful and respectable collapses. The nigredo is the dissolution of the badly built temple, the moment when the structure that had no real foundation meets what it always was, temporary. And here is the point that few people can hold without discomfort. The spiritual crisis, the phase in which life collapses in ways that make no sense, in which certainties disappear, in which what used to work stops working, is not a detour from Thoth's path. It is Thoth's path. In the albedo, the brightening, the disciple begins to see more clearly, not through the eyes of projection and desire, but through something cleaner. He begins to distinguish between what he projects and what actually exists, between the temple he inherited and the temple he could consciously build. The inner geometry begins to be perceived. What was previously invisible because it was assumed to be reality is now recognized as structure, as choice, as a pattern that can be changed. In the rubido, the integration, the disciple does not become a magician who casts spells to get what he wants. He becomes a scribe, someone who operates the mechanism of the mind with responsibility, who uses word, name, symbol, and intention not as tools of personal control, but as technology in service of what Thoth's knowledge asked him to serve. The house of life at that point finally opens, not as a reward, as a consequence. I need to stop here for a moment, because everything I have described up to this point, the demotic text, Thoth the Atlantean, sacred geometry, Setne, the three alchemical phases, can create the impression that we are talking about ancient history and fascinating esoteric traditions. We are not. We are talking about right now, about the mechanism operating inside you as you watch this, about the process that was already happening before this video started and will keep happening after it ends. The mechanism the Book of Thoth describes is not a spiritual technology you activate with rituals. It is the default operation of the human mind, running in you, in me, in absolutely anyone, regardless of whether they have ever read a single Egyptian text. The difference between someone who knows the mechanism exists and someone who does not is this. The person who does not know is being built by the mechanism. The person who knows can, with real work, not with superficial techniques, begin to consciously participate in the building. And the sacred geometry that truly matters is not in the alignments of Giza. It is in the inner architecture of your way of thinking, in the patterns you repeat without noticing, in the stories you hold about why your life is the way it is, in the beliefs that function as walls that you cannot even see because they are the environment, not the object. This was never about a Thoth out there somewhere. It was always about the mechanism Thoth names, and that operates inside every person who is alive and thinking. The question this book asks, and that has been waiting 2,000 years for an honest answer, is this: are you willing to let what was built without foundation be dissolved so that what can be built with foundation may begin? Let me show you the contrast between two types of seeker, because it is in that contrast that the teaching becomes concrete. Setne's story one final time, but deeper now. Setne Khamwas wanted the result without the process. He wanted the book the way someone wants a shortcut, not because he had bad intentions, but because the urgency of wanting was greater than any willingness to be transformed before receiving. He entered the tomb, ignored the warnings, took the text from a dead man, and walked out imagining he now had power. What happened next was the exact operation of a system he had activated without understanding it. The mind, upon upon touching the reality-building mechanism without the inner alchemy that would make that contact safe, amplified with precision the emotional content Setne carried, his fears, his insecurities, the dimensions of himself he had never examined because external power had seemed sufficient to cover them. No spell was cast. What happened was something simpler and more disturbing. The mirror showed what was there. Now contrast that with the nameless disciple of the demotic Book of Thoth. This disciple has no impressive powers. He has no royal lineage. He has one single declared attribute. He loves knowledge, not the result that knowledge could bring, not the power he could wield with it. Knowledge itself, as a process of understanding how things actually are. And Thoth corrects this disciple repeatedly. He dismantles his certainties. He rejects answers that seem correct. He demands the disciple return, not because the disciple is weak, but because each rejection is a piece of the badly built temple being taken apart so that the real temple can begin. The disciple returns because he understood something Setne never did. The correction is not an obstacle to knowledge. It is knowledge arriving in the only form in which it can truly arrive. Now look at your own journey. You have probably been Setne at some point, not because you are arrogant, but because all of us at some point want the result without the dissolution that real results require. We pick up the practice, the technique, the ritual, the law of attraction, the positive affirmation, and we expect the mechanism to obey without us needing to be transformed by it. And when the mechanism amplified what we were carrying, instead of what we wanted, we called it failure, naivety, a sign that these things do not work. But what if Thoth calls that instruction? What if the system did not fail, but simply showed with precision what still needed alchemy before it could be operated responsibly? What separates Setne from the anonymous disciple is not virtue. It is willingness to be corrected. Let me bring together everything I have described up to this point. The demotic Book of Thoth, the lineage of Thoth the Atlantean, sacred geometry as consciousness engineering, the story of Setne, the three alchemical phases, the disciple who loves knowledge. All of it points to one mechanism, a specific mechanism, one that can be verified in your own experience, that requires no faith in any historical or esoteric claim to be perceived. Heka, Egyptian magic, was not a supernatural exception to the natural order. It was the conscious use of word, name, symbol, and intention to act upon the fabric of reality. Not a trick, not illusion. A spiritual technology with very precise requirements. Precise word, correct name, adequate symbol, clean intention. And clean intention does not come before the Negredo, it comes after, much after. Many modern practices, affirmations, visualizations, sigils, the law of attraction are simplified versions of this same principle. The problem is not the technique. The problem is applying the technique without the level of inner discipline and alchemy the principle requires to work in the direction you want. Without the inner work, the mechanism operates. Only it operates with what you carry, not with what you declare. You made it this far in this video because something in this argument touched something real in you. And what I am about to show you now is the complete mechanism in a way that, from this point on, there is no way not to recognize it when it operates. The hidden mechanism of the Book of Thoth is this. It is not a spell. It is not a technique. It is an equation that operates in every human being, all the time, regardless of any spiritual practice. What you hold as truth internally, with emotional consistency and repetition, becomes the structure through which you perceive and therefore generate experience. This is not the law of attraction in its popularized form. The law of attraction, in its most common version, says, think positive, attract positive, focus on what you want, and the universe delivers. The mechanism Thoth describes is deeper, older, and more demanding than that. It says that the quality of your consciousness, not the content of your conscious thoughts, but the structure of the inner temple you have built over a lifetime, determines the field of possibilities you can perceive as real. A mind structured around fear does not perceive opportunities, not because the opportunities do not exist, because the inner temple has no architecture that recognizes them as such. A mind structured around beliefs of insufficiency does not generate experiences of sustainable abundance. Even when it receives abundance externally, it will find ways to return it to the state the inner temple considers normal. This is why someone receives a significant raise and, within a few months, returns to the same financial level as before. Debts that appear, decisions that make no sense in retrospect, opportunities discarded without clear reason. The temple of scarcity operates with precision. It is not conscious sabotage, it is architecture. This is why someone repeats the same pattern in relationships with completely different people. Same dynamic, characters exchanged. Changing partners without altering the inner architecture is changing your address without renovating the building. The pattern continues because the structure that generates it has not changed. That is inner geometry operating. Alchemy, nigredo, albedo, rubedo is not a poetic process. It is the map of what is needed to alter that geometry in a real and lasting way. The nigredo dissolves the structures without foundation. It hurts. It feels like collapse. It is exactly what Setne lived and what the anonymous disciple endured, repetition after repetition, under Thoth's corrections. The albedo reveals the geometry. It shows the structures that were invisible because they were assumed to be reality. It is the moment you begin to see your own patterns from the outside, instead of living inside them as if they were immutable facts. The rubedo integrates. It does not eliminate the past, it incorporates what the process generated. The disciple who has reached the rubedo is not someone who lost what they were before. They are someone who can operate the mechanism of the mind with responsibility, because the inner geometry has been sufficiently rebuilt so that what they create corresponds to what they know at their deepest level they should be creating. The house of life that the Book of Thoth guards, the inner chamber that opens for the disciple who has completed enough of the process, is not a place in Egypt. It was never only a place in Egypt. It is the state of consciousness in which the mechanism of the mind is aligned with the mechanism of reality, in which what you create internally begins to correspond to what manifests externally, not because the universe is obeying you, but because you have finally stopped creating against yourself. That state is not permanent for those at the beginning of the process. It is one, lost, one again, and each time the return is a little faster, a little steadier. Now the claim the Book of Thoth makes with complete seriousness, and that I make with the same, you are not a consumer of spiritual content. If the argument of this video resonated with you in a way that goes beyond intellectual interest, if something here touched a question you have been carrying for a long time, then you are a disciple in training. The only question is whether you will recognize your nigredos as part of the training, or whether you will keep calling failure what Thoth calls instruction. If this video opened a question that had no shape before, an image that stayed with you, a feeling that something you were living as a problem might actually be a process, the only thing I ask is simple. Do not leave here trying to implement everything at once. That is Setne's mistake. the urgency of someone who wants results before the transformation. What serves you is to sit with the question that arose. Let it do its work, because seeds do their work in the dark before anything visible appears. If you want to continue this path, subscribe to the channel. What I build here is not a collection of loose information about spiritual topics. It is a structured process, and each video is a step in that process, even when it does not always appear that way at first glance. And if this video spoke to something someone you know is carrying, not as evangelization, but as recognition that some people are ready for this kind of conversation and sometimes just need someone to point to where it is happening, share it. There is a detail in the dialogue between Thoth and the disciple that has stayed with me since I first encountered it, and that I want to leave here as a closing. At a certain point in the text, Thoth asks the disciple why he seeks knowledge. The disciple who answered before he was ready gave answers about power, about capability, about what he would be able to do with what he learned. Thoth rejected every one. The answer Thoth finally accepted, after many corrections, many returns, much dissolution of what the disciple thought he was about no form of power at all. It was about serving what knowledge asks to be served. I think that is why this text survived empires. Not because the knowledge it guards is more powerful than other knowledge, but because the type of seeker it summons is rare. Someone who loves the process enough to be corrected by it, who does not want the book as a talisman or as a shortcut, who accepts the Nigredo not as punishment but as instruction. That seeker existed in Ptolemaic Egypt and exists now. In the next video, I will bring the question this one opens and that still has no complete answer. What exists on the other side of dissolution? Because the Nigredo dissolves, but dissolution is not the end. It is the moment when the real transmutation begins. Until then,